Despite the inefficiency of the foreign oil companies we were talking about, you still have new technology that comes online.
You do, and one of the best ways to bring it on, Chris, is high oil prices, and that's something we didn't have for a very long time. But
so whenever you have oil prices $100 a barrel for a sustained period of time, well, we haven't had it for sustained, but when they're up high, you have more incentive to go out and drill and find new techniques.
Absolutely, but I agree with them in one sense. I think for the near term, supplies, the difference between supply and demand is going to be extremely tight. I think it's more political right now why we don't have more oil than we do now, as opposed to not being able to find it.
You're talking about Anwar and offshore drilling?
I'm talking about Venezuela. I'm talking about the nationalizing of oil fields, using oil as a political weapon. That's the greatest threat. It's not, we know the oil's out there. It's just a matter of getting it and the politics behind getting it, which is making it more difficult.
Well, Chris, assume for the moment that you're right. And again, there's a lot of people that question your numbers here, but assume that you're right and that we're going to peak out in a couple of years. What do we do? What are the alternatives?
I think the obvious alternative is that prices will have to rise to reestablish a balance between supply and demand. We're going to see oil continuing to go higher as supply-demand equation gets tighter and tighter, and it will have to kill demand in order to bring those prices back down.
But in terms of alternatives that we face as a nation that still will require tremendous uses of energy, not to mention what's happening in China and India, we're going to have to find an alternate source, correct?
Well, I think we're going to do all we can to bring alternates online, and we're also going to do all we can to increase domestic production. But again, it comes down to a question of rate. You know, the U.S. consumes 21 million barrels a day, and it's really going to be difficult for us to bring any additional alternative or unconventional supplies online domestically to compensate for the loss of exports.
Well, hold on a second. Phil, let me just, what percent of the oil that we use as a nation goes towards cars, goes towards automobiles?
I think it's a pretty high percentage.
So say 50%.
Well, not that high.
Does that sound about right to you, Chris? Maybe 40, 50%?
Yeah, 40, 50%.
I believe that's around the right area.
Okay. All right. Well, let's just take that 40 the low end figure.
Okay.
If, for example, Chevy Volt, which is a new electric car, comes online, and the electricity that you use to go per mile in an electric car is about 1/5 the amount of energy that the oil takes. Wouldn't that go a tremendous way to alleviate the oil shortage?
Absolutely. And it goes back to what happened in the 1970s. We were very inefficient with energy consumption. And when that was, and then of course we became a lot more efficient, all of a sudden oil prices went down again. Same thing with this Chevy Volt. If it's successful, if it works, people buy it, then these prices will come down.
And not only will the prices come down, but the amount of oil that we have in the world will increase. We may have a glut that might eventually bring oil prices down.
Yeah, you know how many times the world was running out of oil? You can go back before cars when they were worried about running out of whale oil.
And what happens every time we come to that critical point?
We usually hit an area where we'll have a bust. For every boom in the history of oil since the beginning of the time, eventually I'll show you a bust. And there's a bust coming. I don't know if it's coming today or tomorrow. Hopefully I'll get short and it will happen the next day, but it's coming. And
a bust that will lead to sustained oil below $100 per barrel for months, if not years to come?
For a period of time. You know, we thought in the 1970s that we would never see cheap oil prices. Then in 1990, prices were cheaper than they were before World War I.
And Chris, you don't see oil coming below $100 for a long time, if ever again, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I agree with Phil that switching loads to electric-powered transportation is certainly the future. And if we can do that relatively quickly, we might be able to put enough of a dent in demand that we can bring our demand down and bring the prices back down a little bit. But it's going to take an awful long time to transfer, 200 million vehicles over to electric-based vehicles.
Of course, the Chevy Volt is...
I just don't believe we have that kind of time.
Well, Chevy Volt is coming out pretty quick. They say they're going to move up production. Guys, stay with us if you can. Want to touch on a slightly different subject, going back to the days when they called them obscene profits.
That's
they were huge profits. Yeah. They're not going to be that big, but we're going to see some big profits still.
Now they're going to be mildly offensive. Not totally. No, they're going to be singing "We're in the money." You know what? But you know what? I want the oil companies to be making, David. This is going to be huge because you know what? The oil companies are unlike other businesses. They don't have to compete just with other oil companies. They have to compete with big government-run organizations. They have
that have almost unlimited resources.
Absolutely. And you know what? When we talk about windfall profit taxes on the oil companies, what we're really saying is we're trying to make our oil companies non-competitive in the global race to secure
And Chris
supply.
Nelder, very quickly, but is there any way that the oil companies can use these profits to increase the amount of oil that we have as a world?
Yes, they can, but I don't think it's going to matter substantially. The independent big oil companies only control about 10% of the world's remaining reserves. The other 90% are in the hands of nationally owned oil companies. So Exxon and the rest can do their best, but materially in terms of the flow rate, I don't think it's going to matter too much.
All right, we got to leave it at that. Chris Nelder and Phil Flynn. Thank you, gentlemen. Coming up on